COVID pandemic put a lot of funding of stimulus into the economy. What's happening with those dollars right now? Do we have to make plans for the future of stimulus when our stimulus is no longer stimulating? On today's Coffee Time episode, we're going to talk about some of the things that we can do proactively now to address the reduction in any stimulus funding that you may have received.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee Time with Masterminds. My name is Peta Blakely, and I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I am Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I'm Rebecca Tuttle, founder and principal of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rebecca. Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. If you're just put your name and your let us know up. I'm joined by my co-host, Peta Blakely, Cynthia Rojas. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Hi, Rebecca.
Good.
Rebecca, I think there's something with your audio. You were coming in and out.
Oh, really? It could be because I'm moving.
Oh,
There you
it's
go.
much
It's a lot
better
better
now.
now.
But I do know that you welcomed our viewers and our listeners. So I just want to acknowledge that.
I'm sorry. I also didn't set my green screen, so you have my green screen here today.
Oh, you mean you don't have a wall that's a blackboard? Oh, man.
Our audience is going to be so disappointed.
Oh, you're letting out your secrets. So, Rebecca, this is a timely conversation. I'm glad that we're having it and I love the way you titled it, when the stimulus is no longer stimulating.
You know, I actually found some fascinating resources I wanted to share with everyone today. It's a website that I think everyone should take a look at. And I thought we'd do a little different this morning. We could look at the website and then use that to guide our discussion this morning.
I love that.
All right. So I'm just going to share my screen. Is that okay, Peta?
Yeah, of course.
And I'm going to post the website on the comments.
Okay, great.
Sorry.
All right. So this is usaspending.gov. This is a website. It's a .gov, so it's from the federal government of where all of the stimulus funding is being spent, how much is available from the federal government. I've spent a few hours on this site since we decided to do this topic as a show, and it's just fascinating. You could take a deep dive in here and get lost, so be careful. But it will show you, the option of viewing all of the COVID spending, which we don't have to look at everything. But if you go over to the left side where it says overview, you can look at spending by budget category, by recipient. So if you wanted to look up a specific recipient who received funds, you could. Sub-agency, by CFDA program. Peter, you're going to love this. Data sources and methodology. And then there's a whole bunch of other resources. What I was taking a look at was by the sub-agencies. So then it will bring us down here and it shows you which agencies issued awards using COVID funding. So there were 43 different agencies. And this is interesting. The award obligations for all funding awards totaled $2.34 trillion. That's a lot of money. I mean, I can't even count that high.
That is a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
But what's most interesting is let's take a look at one of these subcategories. I was looking earlier at housing and urban development.
Mm-hmm.
100, are you ready for this? $172.2 billion of stimulus funding is available for COVID relief funding. But what's more interesting is if you look at how much the agency actually spent, they've only spent $20.85 billion. So there is so much funding that is still available that has not yet been spent down, but it is designated. Isn't that incredible?
Well, I'm glad you lifted that because I heard that in the news and I thought, the first thing I thought was, how are we supposed to sift through this? Like, how do we even find this out? So this is an eye-opener.
I know. That's why I told you I got lost. So bring a map. If you are looking, if you're an education organization or if your focus is housing, transitional housing, then I say bring a map. You should be thinking about what specific departments within the federal government or agencies, rather, as they say, that you want to be investigating. Because just when we think, oh no, that COVID relief that we were receiving is about to run out, my suspicion with all of this funding is it isn't necessarily running out, but rather new opportunities are going to come about. And this is a great way for you, all of us really, to gauge where the next pool of resources is going to come from.
And let's talk a little bit about like how that works, because not every not-for-profit or organization is going to want to engage directly with HUD, right? Is going to want to go for HUD funding. But this, and we should also say that, HUD is primarily they're called Housing and Urban Development. So they're primarily going to be available to fund things that are in the space of housing, homelessness prevention, urban development, that kind of thing. But some of this money is going to end up in agencies, right, that might make subgrants. Is that a fair way to say it? So there's still,
yes,
even if you're not yourself thinking you're ready for federal grants, it could still be available in your community.
Absolutely. I'm just going to blow this up a little. I see that it's a little small on the screen. No, those are great points, Peta. And, if you want to figure out what the congressional leaders, your legislators are going to be running on for platforms, this will also give you an idea of maybe some of their campaign messaging that's going to be coming out in election season. And so what we want to do is introduce ourselves to those leaders, those stakeholders now, start talking about our organization's mission and priorities and see how they align with their message, because they are the ones in the congressional seats arguing on behalf of or in rejection of these funds. And we want them to know the importance of that in our community, so they fight for the dollars that are important to the constituents.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Rebecca, did you have enough time, or did you explore an agency, a federal agency that might be trickling down some of this money to our smaller community-based organizations? Because we talk a lot about those smaller groups and the lack of access, or the not having the infrastructure to apply for a big federal grant. So do you know of any of these monies coming down the pipeline?
Well, I know neighborhood reinvestment funding there's a lot of it all over in every major city. You're going to see that. What I was looking for are funding that aligns with a lot of the work that's being done around DE&I.
Yeah.
I saw in the news that a major university is actually pulling that position. And I thought, wow, that's not good, right? That work is not done after a year of COVID or 2 years of COVID. And so I'm trying to figure out, where does the DE&I funding align, and where is it coming from in the major cities through the federal agency funding? And that's going to take a while to figure that out. But let's say we are talking about equal opportunity in housing. So I would be curious, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, does HUD prioritize DE&I in their funding? And you can look at where the funds have been spent, and that'll give you an idea of, okay, well, are the recipients of the funds, are they doing DE&I work? Do they need more help in that area?
I suspect, I don't know this for a fact, but this happens in nonprofit organizations, that this tsunami of money becomes very difficult to manage or to disperse if you still have your existing staff, right? Growth is very hard. So while somebody may look at this and say, I cannot believe they have not spent that money, I look at it and say, I bet you they didn't get too many additional new people to help facilitate the movement of this money. And that this is a problem that nonprofits are having now. I'm talking to a lot of leaders in building the infrastructure they need to sustain all of the growth that they experienced during the pandemic, those who grew exponentially, is becoming challenging to fund. Have
Yeah.
you come across that, you guys?
Yeah, it's hard to sustain. I mean, Rebecca has talked a lot about right sizing your funding, and that going from a small budget to a huge budget in one big leap can be very counterproductive to an organization. And I've definitely seen organizations that do that big leap, and like you said, it's the growth is really uncomfortable, and then aren't necessarily able to get that level of funding again, and have to right size back down.
Yeah.
Right. And federal funding, even state and municipal, any constituent funding it's difficult to obtain. It's also, you have to have the infrastructure to receive those funds. And so there's a lot of steps to set yourself up as an applicant, as a recipient. There's a lot that it entails, and smaller organizations, they just don't have that scaffolding. And it's a catch-22, because if they could just receive one grant, it would set them up for that success. But then do they have that infrastructure to manage those funds?
And so you have to be realistic that
right.
this is the taxpayers' money, and all of this funding gets reported to Congress. So the level of documentation required is massive, and you should expect to have at least one full-time person just on data and evaluation, and at least one full-time person just on accounting, specifically for this grant, right? And that's the bare minimum, right? Your entire accounting infrastructure is going to have to change. Your entire reporting system is going to have to change. It's a huge amount of work. It's great. I mean, having that capacity is fantastic, but it's a big jump to go from being a small organization to managing this level of funding.
Yeah. It's where organizations also start to see that they also need infrastructure around compliance. So making sure that, if you have to use an evidence-based model, that you're adhering to fidelity, that you are doing the components of the model that you're supposed to be doing. So it's the first, for many organizations, the first time they start looking at these other parts of running their business that they didn't necessarily have to think about.
Absolutely. And those positions are costly. I mean, accounting, I would plan on at least $200,000 just for your CFO. And
I mean, a lot of these organizations don't have a CFO.
Right.
Have CFO. That's right. Start with that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the nice thing about constituent funding is we write those costs into the federal grants, but once you receive one, you have to maintain those positions, because you can be audited, I believe, 7 or 10 years. But that's why we hire professionals or experts like PETA, because we don't have what it takes internally to do that level of data and evaluation. And you write those roles into the grant. I wouldn't recommend an organization even take that on. If you had a data person, I would hire out an expert like PETA. Even for the leadership component, that transition of hiring that leadership, I would hire out an expert such as yourself, Cynthia. You really need that outside expertise to set yourself up for success.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's, something to really think about in the ramp up is it's going to take you at least a year just to adjust to having this, right? So Rebecca, what do you tell an organization if they have suddenly received a huge amount of funding like this? How do you help them prepare for the end of the grant, right? What do they need to do to be able to maintain that momentum or prepare for it to end?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm glad you brought it up, PETA, because I know that if our organization hired you to help us with our data and evaluation, you would be checking in regularly to make sure we were on task, to just see how things were going, guide us in the process. That's another reason why you need that outside expertise. As far as planning, you really need a team. You can't do federal funding in silos. It's a recipe for disaster. A lot of times when you apply for constituent funding, also, you're assigned a program officer or someone from that fund who's going to be sending you reporting that's due, sending you materials, be available for Q&A. Really need to take advantage of all of those resources that are available. And
they'll often give you TA too.
Yes, technical assistance, absolutely.
Yeah, somebody else that you can meet with, trainings, like,
And even prior to the submission of your application, there are webinars, there's Q&A posted. I highly encourage all my students, you should be visiting grants.gov if you want to pop that there, Cynthia, in the chat. They have an entire Grants 101 just to give you information, education on how to even be a recipient as well as an applicant. So there are so many resources out there, albeit they're a little dry to spend your day listening to them all the time, but it's well worth the effort and time.
Well, let's ask you, Rebecca. It's dry, but you enjoy this work. So tell me the joy that one can get out of this.
Yeah.
I'm just going to try to pull up this grants.gov just to give everyone a site can't be reached. I must have typed it in wrong. Sorry, guys. Okay. I love it. I'm a research writer. Yes, I'm a fund development expert, and I write grants and help with fundraising, but I'm a research writer. At the end of the day, I believe that grant writing is research writing. And the more that you can research and explore these opportunities, the process, learn about it, the better your proposals are going to be. And by better, we want our proposal to be all the way up here at the top of the funding considerations, and it's evident. It's evident in your writing because it's persuasive writing that's research based. We're citing citations, and funders recognize applications that did their due diligence and their homework grantees, and then grantees that didn't. And you can go down some rabbit holes and, go off track. That's why I always say, bring a map, write out what your plan is ahead of time and build out your strategy. And the only last thing I want to say is that I actually use logic models to do my fund development research because it helps me stay organized.
Oh, tell us how so.
So, we've walked through in a couple of episodes, and I think we should actually in the comments after the show maybe tag some of those episodes if our listeners want to go back and watch them or listen to them. But I'll write the activities and, on the left side, and then what is our goal for the short term, for raising funds in the immediate, raising funds in the long term, and then what are the projects that we're trying to receive funding for. And a great logic model, and PETA can speak more to this, and you as well, Cynthia, but a great logic model tells a story across the model. And that's what I try to do with our fund development and sustainability planning.
So you're creating a logic model for the fund development itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Where that documents the outcomes for the organization. I think that's fantastic. Yeah.
Another thing I have found is that, again, talking to leaders about this growth and how do they build the infrastructure that they need, is I find that grant writing still falls on one person in general.
Yeah.
And sometimes if they have a grant writer, it could be outsourced, it could be part-time, and then it's the ED who's also doing some grant writing. And you said something earlier that I thought was critical, this idea of don't do it alone. Federal funding can be really intimidating.
Absolutely.
But doing it with a team really helps to break it down into small bites, which is how you want to see it, because otherwise it's a huge undertaking. And so let's talk about why we may want to go after federal funding as a nonprofit. So let's pretend the three of us are a nonprofit. And so we're thinking about applying for our first federal grant. Rebecca, try to convince us.
You see that expression of fear? Like, are we really?
Nice. I was waiting for more.
Rebecca, try to convince us why we should do this.
Yeah.
Well, you know what a go, no go sheet is, right? They're used across a whole host of industries. So first you have to compile your team. And even if, again, you have that evaluator, hire out that expertise. And if you're really going in, it's like tipping your toe in a pool of cold water. You're either going in or you're not. You're already in your swimsuit. You might as well dive in, right? But you want to make sure there's a lifeguard there, someone to help you in case you get into trouble. If you're making the commitment, I wouldn't start at the application phase, gathering your team. I would start even before. And that's with a go, no go sheet. So, I would write out in my logic model all of the resources that we need to be able to be applicants for federal and state funds. And then I would say, okay, well, what are the costs associated? Let's tap into our finance director here for some of that information. When you're building your team, you also want to be very clear about assigning roles, right? We talk about stay in your lane. You want to stay in your lane. If you can do budgets in grants, you need a finance person to do budgets in a federal grant. Now, I've created federal grants, but I'm always passing it off for that other glance, for that higher expertise there in that particular area. So go, no go. Can we afford this team? That should never deter you. A lot of the costs you can write into your actual application. The question should be, can we sustain this when the grant is over? Because you don't want to.
And I would say that the planning for taking on federal funding starts well before you're applying for the federal funding, right?
Absolutely.
It's about, growing your organization up to be ready for that funding. And in my experience, it's very rare for an organization to get federal funding the first time they apply.
Right.
So even consider that application process a 3-year project, right? Where you're going to apply and get feedback and try a couple more times.
And a training opportunity.
Yeah.
A training.
And the application itself requires dedicated project management.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
So, even if you think you can do the writing internally, you need somebody to manage the process.
A lot of times, well, I was just going to say, a lot of times organizations will hire me to help with their grant writing on federal applications so that there's multiple people writing, multiple people editing, taking certain sections. You have to remember, federal grants sometimes are upward of 150 pages. That's a lot of pages of writing,
Yeah.
That's
and it's such a huge amount of work, but that is the opportunity to get your entire organization to understand what you're going for and why. Because if you do get it, it's gonna make some significant changes happen in your organization, and people should be on board and understand them.
Absolutely. And it should never, just want to reiterate this again, be about, well, we can't really afford that. The question should be, well, what does our community need? Are we providing the level of resources that our community needs right now at the level of capacity that we have? So maybe your first federal application is capacity building to help you with that no, go, and go process and that preliminary training and all of the things that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
So that was my question. Like, why should an organization take on federal funding? So I'm happy with my local foundation, and they fund us, and there are 3 people on my team, and we do everything, and we laugh, and we have a great time. Why should I even think or fantasize about federal funding?
Well, I think a lot of applicants, a lot of grantees, they get used to private foundations funding you over and over the years. But the important thing to note is they are not obligated, private foundations, to fund you consecutively. And that funding is a lot smaller. So as your organization is growing, can those private foundations grow with you? Maybe not, maybe they can. But more importantly, that funding, there's a pretty significant chance, especially in a struggling economy, that you're going to see more disruption in a private foundation fund than you will with a federal opportunity, because as we've seen, these relief funds come out, whereas private foundations, they have relief funding, but it's a little different, if that answers your question.
And they can just change their direction. I mean, they also have a mission and a strategic plan. And, so you have to diversify your funding.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I love that reason, especially the ones who depend on their community foundation. And there is a lot of vulnerability in a community foundation pivoting. We've seen that with COVID, right? There are many organizations that lost their funding because foundations decided to focus on COVID-related activities or DE&I. And so if you had a nonprofit that wasn't taking on any of those efforts, or whose efforts did not include those two categories, you could have potentially lost future funding or not been part of the pool for their future funding. I think federal funding also puts you in a whole different sandbox. You start looking at evidence-based practices. You start learning from experts. You go to conferences. The PO, if you have a good PO, you'll get resources that many of us don't have access to right now. So it really does elevate your game. And Rebecca, I love what you said. It is about serving the community. And so how best to do that? And if federal funding helps to build your internal infrastructure and allows you to serve more people and use evidence-based models, then why not?
Right. And there are other things that you can do aside from applying yourself. So now let's say here we are, it's 2022. Maybe in 2024, we're going to feel as though we can confidently apply for federal funding. Now, if it's early 24, we're looking at that fund in 23. So really, we have about a year and a half before we really set up to start the process. Some of the things that we can do in the interim, aside from the learning and upping our knowledge and skill, is we can collaborate with other organizations who are versed in federal funding, who have experienced federal funding as grant recipients, and they can write us into their applications. It will provide us the opportunity to allow funders to take note of our organization, and it'll also give us some experience of what federal funding entails. So don't ever underestimate collaborative efforts as a way of introducing your organization to federal funding opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Well, we're almost at the end of our show.
Wow.
Rebecca, I mean, the timing for this could not have been better, because there's a lot of anxiety in what happens afterward. And we probably focus more on why to apply and for federal funding. But you're also helping leaders see that thinking long-term is essential, and that there's still money there.
Oh, yes. A lot of money, a lot of money, trillions of dollars.
Yes.
Yeah. And that money is going to be trickling through the system.
Yes.
Right? So, even if you're not getting it directly from federal agencies, it's going to be in the community. It's going to be available for subgrants.
Yes. And so getting your politicians, your local politicians, to learn about your work is essential. I'm sorry.
Right.
Rebecca.
I was just going to say, we haven't done key takeaways in a while. And that's actually what I wanted to bring up as a key takeaway is now is the time to start introducing yourself to your congressional and legislative leaders, paying attention to the news articles that are coming out where these funds are designated, really getting your foot in the door knowledge-wise is only going to help you in the long run, especially if you're considering this unsurmountable task of federal grant writing, federal funding. But the other thing too is we're available offline outside of this show. So even if you wanted to pick our brains about, the processes as well, you're more than welcome to do that.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, we are done for this show, but we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you so much.
Have a good weekend, everybody.